Henderson, to begin with, is the state's public liberal arts institution. It is already looking broader, teaching people to look at a variety of different things, consider many different possibilities. People misunderstand what liberal arts means. It does not mean something politically liberal. It's more like liberally salting your food. Be generous with the education. Get a variety of spices. Learn about a lot of different things to have a wide view of the world. That's kind of a nerdy thing to begin with, to be broadly educated.
One thing about Henderson that I think has made it possible to gestate all sorts of creative things, including this love of comics, which is clearly here, is even though it's a small state university, it tries to model itself on the traditional small liberal arts university, meaning that you don't necessarily, as a professor, have to spend your entire career focusing on, say, the pheromones of ants or something like that, because we're encouraged to think broadly and creatively and logically.
Yeah, I think in our faculty members, you see people that are truly visionary, in my opinion. A wise man once said, the role of the teacher is to cause the student to learn, which means that you pull into your entire bag of tricks or your entire toolkit and bring out opportunities that excite students, motivate students, inspire students to learn, and that's what they've done. They've taken this beautiful art form, and if you think about it very closely, they've embedded psychology, they've embedded graphic art, design, art itself, they've embedded communications, journalism, and so taking all these disciplines and interrelating these disciplines in such a way that gets students excited. So yes, Batman may be the cover, if you will, that gets people in, but once they're there, they're going very deep into all of those disciplines. I've always been a big comic book fan. I'm a Marvel guy, although I grew up a DC guy initially. But still, my favorite superhero of all time is Wonder Woman. And the fact that Dr. Langley's done a book on Wonder Woman really excited me. And being able to read it, but watching my wife read the book, watching my 16-year-old daughter read the book, and then watching the movie has been really fascinating. But just being able to say, I know that guy, is really neat.
Dr. Duncan paved the way for all of this nerdy education here at Henderson long before I did. If he had not been doing what he does, I would not be doing what I'm doing now.
I guess I've been a bit of a proselytizer. I wouldn't say it's definitely the mission, but I'm always pushing things toward people, saying consider this.
So he paved the way. He was the mentor over the comics club. He started the comics and communication class, and without him laying the foundation, the rest of us who are in these wouldn't be doing the things we're doing now. The nerdy side of my life, the professor side of my life would still be two different tracks, and I wouldn't have my Batman book. I'd have a completely different life if I didn't have these books now.
Well, personally, I was kind of totally unaware of what was out there at that time. But there wasn't a whole lot in the English language. Things had been happening in Brazil, been happening in France, Belgium, to some extent in Japan, but I was oblivious to all of that. Also, John Lent, who is still very, very active, was putting together some bibliographies about things that had been written about comics in different countries. And so he's done this wonderful work over the decades of just traveling the world, meeting artists in different parts of Asia and Africa, and not only documenting their work, but the things that have been written about comics in those countries and those languages. But as far as things that were in the U.S., there were popular books. They were sold more as trade kind of coffee table books oftentimes. There was one of them by Reitberger and Fuchs. I think it's Comics Anatomy of a Mass Medium, that came out in the early 70s, and it came out in this country in the early 70s, and it was translated pretty quickly into English. And I only learned recently in working on the Secret Origins of Comic Studies book that had begun as a graduate seminar, that these two young Germans who loved comics and loved American comics one of their professors, kind of like my professor encouraged me, one of the professors said, you should teach a seminar on that. And they come out of media studies. So the first thing I'd ever read, even though it was written for a popular audience, and it didn't look like a academic book, even then I could tell it kind of had underlying, communication and media theory there. So that was one of the things I kind of grasped onto early on, is something to wave around, to talk about, hey, these can legitimately be studied, and gave me kind of an inkling that, other people were doing that. I didn't actually finish my dissertation until 90, May of 90 is when I officially became a doctor and finished that. So most of my academic work related to comics was finishing that dissertation on the rhetoric of comic book form. And it might have been while I was still doing that. So it was either 90 or 91 or somewhere in there, maybe even 89. I taught it under special topics. We had a number of things in the catalogs that were called, special topics of communication, and you could do different things. I had become chair about my third year here when I was still a youngster, because our chair had moved to a different university, and I'm not sure why, but I was the person that she had confidence in, that you should kind of take over, and so she transitioned me into that. And as chair, I gave myself permission to teach a special topics comics course. It might not have gone as smoothly if that hadn't been the case. And so it was just kind of under the radar first 3 or 4 times I did that. And I did that about every other year.
My office has been next to his office for over 25 years. And so the comics have oozed into me continually. I mean, I've heard so many conversations, met so many comic artists that he would invite. And he's the one who first let me know there was such a thing as nonfiction comics. I was never aware of that at all. But I don't know exactly how the idea for the class came up. Do you remember that?
I don't know. I mean, Randy and I had taught a concept course called The Big Idea, and yeah, I think we were
That's
just
right.
looking for something else to do collaboratively, and comics being the cancer upon the earth that it is, just seemed to
Well,
spread out from Randy's office to
that's
everyone.
right. I was always envious because you guys did that big idea, and I wanted to horn in. The nonfiction comics gave me the opportunity to do that
Yeah.
because you needed a journalist on the team.
Yeah, we had artists and journalism students and 3 professors, and that's the way it's been for about, I think we taught it 3 times.
Yeah, 3 times over about a 4-year period.
Yeah, about every other year we tend to teach it.
At first, I think, Mike Taylor, David Stoddard were a little reluctant about the nonfiction comics course, but as we got into doing it, they were very enthusiastic about it, and then the 3 of us co-authored a book that was not at all my idea. They drove that much more than I did.
And somewhere along the way, we were developing all sorts of exercises and material for the class, and we quickly realized there is no textbook for a class like this. Very few places had even taught nonfiction comics courses in the past, and those that had not had a textbook for it. So with Randy having written The Power of Comics, which is a wonderful textbook, and the way the textbook for our class came about is he was scheduled to speak at the International Communication Association meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, on a panel about nonfiction comics, and he had another event to go to, and so he asked if I would go in his place and speak on that panel, and I said sure. And he said, and I want you to say hi to my editor, Erica Wetter, while you're there. I said, sure. And so in the course of saying hi to Erica in Phoenix, I told her about our nonfiction comics class and said, we really wish there was a textbook in this area. And she said Rutledge would be very interested in publishing it if we could come up with one. And so that began a year of us pulling each other's hair out to get it done.
And we've done a number of workshops at different places on nonfiction comics. So it's the kind of thing that, the enthusiasm is kind of contagious oftentimes.
we all use examples. All the time, we always use examples. Remember when you would take a math class and you do a problem, what this train is approaching that train at this speed, and they're coming at this speed, when will they meet? You do your math to calculate when the trains will meet. For somebody who loves trains, that's a great way to learn their math. We have a professor at this university who teaches a math of baseball class. For somebody who loves baseball, that's a great way to learn their math. Some of the topics that would make people really uncomfortable talking about real people, we can talk about the same thing we know about real people through the fictional example. When I teach forensic psychology, some of that is really unpleasant stuff. Talk about the psychology of crime and criminals and how people are affected. Unfortunately, there is enough of a body of research to know a lot about kids who've lost their parents to crime, kids who've even witnessed their parents murder. Now, talking about real kids, that can be so heart-wrenching that the students miss the point that I'm trying to make, the psychology that I'm trying to teach. I can talk about Bruce Wayne, whose parents are murdered in an alley. I can use the same things we know from those real people, but through this filter of fiction, and they're into what I'm talking about, they're getting the point that I'm making, and it stays with them better. So that's an emotional barrier. Fiction has to be truer than real life, or it doesn't work. If it's too detailed with all the ums and the ahs and the stopping to tie your shoes, it doesn't make a good story, and it doesn't have the flow. It has to get to the point of what is really going on, leaving out the ums and ahs and the tying the shoes. Well, this tying the shoe gets you hit by a car, then it becomes part of the plot. It cuts to the point of what is going on, what's truth in human nature. And you can use that to talk about real human nature.
So I get a lot of people, sometimes about half the class are people that, I love comics, but they've never actually read a comic. But they love the movies that are based on comic book characters. So that's kind of funneled more people into that, and part of my mission in the class is to get them interested in the form, and maybe they become comic book readers afterwards. But there was just so much, if you look around here, not only all the graphic novels that are being done, but all that's being written about comics. So one reason I ended up with a textbook is all those years I was doing the special topics course, I was creating material. There was no curriculum material for it, and so I kind of accumulated that over the years. But now, there are hundreds of academic books to choose from, half a dozen different academic journals just devoted to comic studies. So it's a nice problem to have, but the other problem is what to use in the class out of all the things that are possible. Whereas when I started, there was hardly anything to choose from. I would say that the vast majority of campuses have some sort of comics course being taught. Sometimes that is under special topics still. Sometimes that is, oftentimes in English departments, a freshman level course where they get a good bit of latitude about what they do. So maybe like one unit in that it deals with comics, or although if they're in an English department, they have to say graphic novel, so that that smooths the way. But truthfully, I actually just finished co-authoring an article about the rise of the legitimacy of the graphic novel. And that very terminology has made it easier for people in academics, and truthfully for people in English departments.
In terms of the kind of value that faculty can draw on comics in their teaching, there's a number of ways really to teach with comics. You can teach strictly for content, which I think is why we had Mouse, Persepolis, and Palestine. I don't think anybody was doing in-depth analyses of how the medium was used in those books. It was basically, here's another story that might be of interest in a potentially more digestible format. But you can also teach comics in terms of the historical significance, which to a great extent is the American Studies approach. What has this medium meant in American cultural history, in terms of humor, in terms of ways that it has reflected political, social, cultural mores. You can teach the medium itself. I teach a course in the summertime comics as literature, which is close reading. I try to get people away from the plot, concentrate on themes, and concentrate on the decisions that the artist and writer have made in order to make the page, the panel, look the way it does. You know, why does this panel bleed rather than stay confined in its borders? Why does this character break out of a panel? These are things that it's learning to read a medium, and that is a common thing that is taught. You know, how do you learn to read a film? How do you learn to read a painting? How do you learn to read a comic? So there's a lot of approaches. There's a lot of approaches to teaching film. There's a lot of approaches to teaching literature. This is another medium, and it's a medium that has its own conventions and its own style and its own methodologies. And it's a medium worth learning.
There's a certain reaction that some cartoonists have towards the academization, which is a terribly cumbersome word I just made up, of comics, where they're like, you can't teach comics. Like, I learned comics the hard way, came up through the mean streets of comics. And especially in the early days of CCS, of the program in Vermont, I know there's a lot of pushback and publicly, and I just don't see a problem with it. You know, I think that obviously it's a hard industry. It always has been. It probably always will be. And so, and a lot of that pushback was like, you're going to take the money of, you know, people and train them in comics, and it's hard to make a living in comics. But grading MFAs have been around since, you know, whenever the Iowa Writers Workshop started up. And I think that there's a value in bringing art forms into the academy and developing a critical establishment that's talking about them, and developing a whole sort of group of people that are thinking really seriously about them and about the craft of it, and are interacting with each other. Like, one of the things that these programs do is they bring groups of people together and they network them. And, you know, I stay in touch with all my classmates. The people that went to SVA do as well. The people that go here do as well, I'm sure. And so you end up with these much stronger networks than I think there used to be. And I just can't help but think that's a good thing.
Really, comic studies were growing up simultaneously in a lot of places, but Randy was certainly one of those pioneers, bringing academic respectability to the study of comics as an art form. And it's happened here, I think, in part because there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on him to do other types of scholarship that would have kept him from doing that. And, you know, ironically, or although it's not ironic because it's a direct result, Henderson got very positive national attention as Randy became, you know, one of the co-founders of the Comic Arts Conference, and you know, there's I think he sort of paved the way for Travis Langley to do the same thing in the field of psychology and begin writing the books that he's written, and you know, both of them taking their own students in their own fields to Comic-Con to present posters and otherwise get involved. It's definitely an area of specialty, but I think it's because we're a small university with a liberal arts model that we've been able to do that.
My year ends and begins with San Diego Comic-Con. 2007 was the first time I've gone, so I've been going for a decade now. My calendar's... I've spent most of my life on an academic calendar to begin with, so it's easy to think of that division for the year anyway. These students that we take, they get there, and some of them, their eyes are just wide at all that they're seeing. The masses of nerdy people. And most are not in costume. Most are not obviously anything particularly nerdy. But you know they're all in this environment that is celebrating the nerdiness. And that's meaningful to them. Some of these students, they learn interesting things through the Comic Scholars. A lot of them are doing poster presentations. Once in a while, one of them winds up on a panel doing an oral presentation, and these are good experiences for them.
That's sort of an intense situation. You know, there you are. You just have to explain that research and over, and you got all these professors roaming around who are asking you questions about it. And so, and I'm always proud of the students of how well they know their stuff. I mean, we hope that if we have selected them to be part of that, you know, that they're ready. But there's never been any of them that I've, you know, haven't been proud to say, hey, he or she's from my school, you know.
Through the comic studies minor, I was able to go to San Diego Comic-Con and present research there.
But if sometimes, or in the beginning, it was bad, but now it's better, they got a 0.5. And if they had a really sensitive costume like Squirrel Girl, they got a 1. And so a 7 would be a perfect standard. There were 4 characters that got a perfect score. And then,
which was incredible. I actually ended up being able to speak on a panel at Comic-Con there as well. And it was a very surreal experience because at one point, everyone on the panel turned to look at me to answer questions because they considered me an expert on the question. And these are people that I have looked up to that run websites that I check regularly and people who create comics that I enjoy, you know, so that couldn't have happened without the comic studies minor and, you know, Dr. Duncan Langley. And the opportunities I was given there. My senior research was about comic studies stuff and tied seamlessly into my minor, and I'm looking on getting that published into print journals. No luck so far, but with our fingers crossed, I should be hearing back in the next couple of weeks, I think. And in general, it really inspired me to take my interests and make them something more than just a hobby that you keep on the side. That's what I've tried to really put all my energy into, all of my hobbies and interests like comics, you know, social justice issues, stuff like that. I've been able to spin them into my career and hopefully, you know, in future months I can start going to cons more, talking to people, maybe being on more panels and having it be a viable career option eventually. Like I'd like to be able to write books or at least get essays published in books and be able to become somewhat of an authority in my area, if that's not too narcissistic to say. So that all couldn't have happened without the comics minor. And I think it's a really incredible, not trailblazing, but right up with the trailblazers kind of opportunity.
We were like second or third in the nation, I think, to do it. And actually, there may be others that have cropped up I don't know about, but it seems to be kind of be gaining momentum, and ours is just a couple of years old. The skills they get in the comic studies courses, you know, could be used in lots of different ways. Because it really kind of comes down to putting together words and images in sequences to have an effect on someone. And that person might end up being in advertising, you know, and things that they've learned in those kinds of courses are going to make them more effective in that job. I think it's the sort of thing that is going to be useful to them in lots of different ways. Some of them, you know, want to create comics, which is a hard thing to break into nowadays. Some people just love comics and want to know more about them. Others know that they like storytelling, like narrative, and they're not sure in what way they might want to do that. Do they want to be a filmmaker? Do they want to be a game designer? Do they want to be a writer? So it's partly the fact that we do, you know, live not only a visual culture, but a transmedia culture. And more comics are being used not just for entertainment, but as a way to inform people, educate people, for propaganda. You know. So just lots of organizations and institutions that are using comics nowadays, and so having that is one of the tools in your arsenal of communication, I think, can be important.
Actually, the reason either one of us are probably interested in comics on the level that we've become is because for many years, Randy Duncan was able, because of his connections with the Comic Arts Conference, which is kind of the academic arm of Comic-Con, he's become friends with many, many significant comic artists. And so he would somehow lure them to come to little old Arkadelphia and come to he would bring them in on a margin of excellence grant. And usually they're artists also, they're comic authors and artists.
And so I started getting work doing comics about refugee crises, about political violence, real upbeat stuff. This was for Slate.
And so I would co-author some of those with him just because of my art connection. And so he would bring people like Scott McCloud.
Just thought it'd be really cool to swing by and talk to you guys. This is very open-ended. I have very little prepared, but I'm fascinated by comics. I've been making comics since 1983 professionally.
Just some very significant artists. Steve Bissett over the years that have drawn for DC Comics and some pretty interesting, cool things.
Or comic writing. What is consistent with merchandise and comics is one thing, and that is that art is a medium. So, in other words, there's a reason why you read a comic as opposed to reading the transcript. Could you imagine going to a store and being like, oh, I want a copy of Spider-Man issue 57. Okay, here it is. Like, no, I don't want the art, I just want the text. Well, no one does that. And the reason why is because comics as a medium was designed to be both read.
And so because Randy would bring all these people in for, many years, like 20 years he's probably been bringing them in. We finally kind of took notice. And so, the tradition of bringing significant people in really is Randy's baby.
I can remember from my own personal experience the effect that not only seeing working artists had, you see people, like comics is sort of a real thing, but when you interact with somebody that's actually doing it, it sort of becomes a little bit more real somehow. And I remember the effect that had on me, and so I'm always very mindful, or try to be, I don't know, like in the moment it's hard, but I always try to be very mindful of the fact that interacting with a cartoonist is really cool for a lot of these kids, and that just dealing with them as like a fellow artist that's trying to express themselves and trying to grow and trying to figure out what interests them and what they want to do with the talents that they're cultivating is really cool, and that maybe you'll have some sort of effect years down the line. I would never know, of course, but just the idea of that is really cool. Yeah.
Even though there are comic studies and popular culture courses and even programs probably in other universities, we kind of have a unique thing for the size we are, and it's just kind of nice to have a little culture where students especially are excited about it. I think there are even some students that come here because we have at least a minor in comics studies.
And, this isn't entirely fair to, say, professors who study 17th century British novels, or 18th century British novels, I guess are the better ones. But comics are appealing to the media. And so we've gotten a lot of press coverage. Randy's been interviewed, TV, newspapers, magazines, and as has Travis Langley, and both of us have occasionally been interviewed.
And the Comic-Con culture was evolving and arriving also simultaneously, so I think that probably helped push things along.
Right. When at least a couple of episodes a season of Big Bang Theory are devoted to Comic-Con, people are more aware of it.
And again, you're seeing students who will emerge on the other side of that with incredible skill sets that other students simply don't have. And so to have faculty members who cite students in such an incredible way, who are considered to be the leaders in their field. They are the recognized leaders right here at Henderson State University, and giving of their time not just to teach or research or create, but the amount of time they give investing in the lives of our students, I think says a lot about them and what they're wanting to do with their careers and with the students they impact. And so for me, I get excited when I hear those names. I get excited when I hear Comic Com. I didn't know what Comic Com was until I came to Henderson and learned more about this exciting new discipline.
In terms of the future for comic studies, I've heard the analogy to film studies in the 60s. Comic studies now are kind of where film studies were in the 60s. It was a nascent discipline, not necessarily looked at with anything other than an askance eye. It was often part of an English department, and the English department didn't necessarily want to spin it off into a separate department because it would mean losing enrollment, which is something that's very important in academia. So comic studies, it's spreading. There's a comic scholars listserv. I'm always astonished to see how many people are on it, how many people are teaching courses, not simply where they use comics, but where the comics is the primary focus. And coming at it from every disciplinary perspective you can imagine. So the future is bright. I believe the future is bright. I believe that comics as a medium is growing in its sophistication, both in story and in style, and it's inevitable that that will be picked up by academics and become a source of interest. And you know, I'm trained as a medievalist, and the things that were ephemera in the medieval and early modern period, you know, the sort of things that somebody would just throw on a midden heap, are now valued and kept in rare book and manuscript libraries. So I think that anything that is scorned in the contemporary age is almost always going to be of fascination to a future age. And comics aren't even that scorned anymore. So I have high hopes.
Well, I'd shoot for as accepted as film, probably first. I mean, it's not exactly the same trajectory that it's following, but I think it's a similar sort of thing. There was a lot of resistance to, that's ridiculous, you can't study film at the college level, you know, when people first started doing that. And now, pretty much every institution, you know, at least has an intro to film course, and, you know, obviously you can get, you know, film degrees at all levels. I think we're still a good ways away from that. I don't, you know, I'm going to try to take care of myself and live a good bit longer, but I don't know if I'll live long enough to see someone get that PhD in comic studies. You know. But I think a BA in comic studies, you know, I'll get to see some of those. You know, when I was growing up, the job I wanted was to be Stan Lee when I grew up. I wasn't sure exactly what he did, but he seemed to be having fun doing it. Yeah, I realized, you know, this was a pretty good thing I fell into, which I did kind of fall into it. I wasn't working in anything very impressive when I graduated from college, probably because I moved to Baton Rouge to follow a girl. But and then my car broke down, and at that same time, my former debate coach said, "Do you want to come back here and be my graduate assistant?" I finally have an assistantship position, and the next thing I knew, you know, I had a master's degree. I was in a doctoral program, and I was just lucky, and yeah, to some extent, made my own luck in that. I didn't get to be Stan Lee, but I just got back from a conference in San Diego where I gave a presentation about him, and I'm working on a book about him, and you know, so I'm still getting to kind of be the fanboy for a living.